Thank you to Seth and to Martha and to all of the groups that have helped with this event and an event we had earlier this afternoon. I'm amazed that people have turned out in a snowstorm. Nobody in Virginia would do that for any speaker. There's some people were coming to this event, went to the earlier one. The earlier one was packed, and it was a very good event. Lots of great questions and discussion, and I hope we'll have the same here shortly. I was asked to bring and talk about two books. One is called War No More, The Case for Abolition. This is my newest book, and it's kind of a guide to and arguments for eliminating the entire institution of war and debunking of contrary arguments. And you can get it at any bookstore or online, any bookseller, etc. But I'm sorry we sold out to the last event and the early comers here. But I'll talk also about another book that I have here called When the World Outlawed War. I think it's worth noting when I would talk at events like this shortly after Barack Obama moved into the White House, I started getting questions that I never got when Bush was president, questions about why we shouldn't all slit our throats, and why we shouldn't go hide under our beds and give up, and wasn't it pointless, and why do petitions and online actions, and isn't protesting kind of out of date? And I'm not getting those anymore. I'm not getting them in Maine or anywhere else. People seem to have gone through that cycle of stupid optimism and stupid pessimism, and they're back to sort of a normal place, and they're ready in an increasing degree to engage. And this country's public opinion and those of other countries around the world are moving against war. And it's not against particular wars or Republican wars. It's more against the idea of wars. And I find this very, very encouraging. So I wrote this book as an argument for people like you, who I know many of you and imagine most of you are somewhat the choir to be preaching to, but an argument of resources for you to take in talking to others who tell you that war is in our genes, or war is needed for the next Hitler who's coming to kill and rape us, or war benefits those poor nations that we bomb for their own good, to save them from genocide, and so forth. And then I heard from a few people who've been doing peace activism for, long before I was born, who wanted to try starting up something that's been tried before in various ways, but we think is needed and that the timing is right, and that is a global coalition to abolish war, to do away with war entirely and to replace it with more effective as well as nicer means of handling conflicts, as well as avoiding the creation of conflicts, and to establish a just and a sustainable peace in the world. And so this is a peace movement that's envisioned as broader, wider, inclusive of more groups and more international, and not aimed at civilizing war, at getting rid of this weapon or that tactic or preventing this bombing, but scaling back, reducing, and eliminating the institution of war. And we're calling this World Beyond War, and we set up a website called WorldBeyondWar.org. There are yellow cards going around asking you if you'll sign a very short declaration of peace that says you want to help work against war. And thousands of people have signed this in the past few weeks from 53 countries last I checked. Now, the U.S. military is in 177 countries last I heard, so we're not where we need to be yet. But hundreds of organizations, including various state chapters of Peace Action. I'm not sure about Maine, but Peace Action Maine and every other organization is warmly invited to sign on, as well as the national organizations, and I know the National Peace Action brought it up at a recent meeting. I'm not sure what came of that yet, but one of the things we've done is to try to put on the website of WorldBeyondWar.org the case for debunking pro-war arguments and the strongest and most well-documented anti-war and pro-peace arguments. And so I'm going to try, we tried this in Brunswick, my first time ever attempting to use visual aids. I've always just talked for years and years, and of course, as I expected, it completely failed. But we're going to try it here, and we think it's going to work. So let's see if it does. And this is sort of a visual summary with my spoken additions making the argument that we can do away with war, and that we should, and that we need to, and how to do it. And this is a presentation that's available on the website for anyone who wants to download it and use it themselves to speak to a local group. And it ends with a video that itself makes a great introduction to a discussion. I don't know if we'll try to show the video, and if we do, if we'll succeed, but I'm going to try to use this. And amazingly, is this a good compromise? Compromise is actually a useful skill to replace bombs, missiles. Okay, let's consider this good and move forward, shall we?
I'm available for hire.
So one of the parts of the case against war is confronting what we call myths that support war. The idea that it's inevitable, necessary, beneficial, and various other myths are encompassed under those headings. So looking at the idea, this is cool, it's working. Looking at the idea that war is inevitable, people will tell you it's in our genes, it's in our blood, it's in our species. Chimpanzees do it. It's been done forever. You can't stop it if you try, which is, of course, as ludicrous as that argument always is with slavery or sexism or anything else that is supposedly in our genes. You know, when you say something is in our genes, what you mean is it's in our culture. I'm a little bit ashamed of it, but I want a good excuse. That's all it means. War was not used by hunter-gatherers. War did not exist for most of our species prehistory. War has existed in some complex sedentary societies and not others, and been abandoned by some that had it. It is not something that's imposed on us by our genes. My favorite story of an anthropologist trying to understand the mindset of someone in another culture was asking a hunter-gatherer man why he would not use his bow and arrow for hunting to shoot slave raiders who were coming to enslave him and his family. Why not? Use it. And the man's response, because it would kill them. An absolute inability to comprehend that a human being could choose to kill a human being, just outside of his worldview. Now, it's completely inside of our worldview. It's on our televisions, video games, children's stories. We're saturated with it. But that guy's genes are the same as our genes, exact same genes. Right? So it's not physical. We also have yet to record a single case of someone suffering post-traumatic stress disorder from war deprivation. There's no need for war. There's no desire for war built into our bodies. People have to be trained and conditioned, and the militaries have learned very well over the past several decades how to condition people to shoot without thinking, to kill without thinking. They have yet to do much in the way of conditioning them to come back from war in a healthy state of mind and body. But if anything is natural, I mean, natural is also, again, often a completely meaningless word that means I need an excuse for something that we do that's awful. But if anything is natural, it is cooperation. We wouldn't be here without cooperation. Killing is not easily handled. The risk of death and the imposition of death on others is very, very hard for people. So war is not imposed on us. It's not beyond our control. It's not the case that if climate change and mass migrations create crises and population explosions create crises, then we will have war to handle those crises. It is only the case that if we continue to view war as the tool with which to handle crises, then that's what we will use. But it's a cultural choice. It's not imposed by history or capitalism or genetics or testosterone. It's something that is in our culture that can be taken out of our culture. So it's an option. We can end it. we also have the idea that war is necessary. There's evil in the world. There's genocide in the world. We must do something about it, and war is the tool. War is needed to defend ourselves. Well, war is actually counterproductive, right? Nobody has heard of an anti-Canadian terrorist network, an anti-Norwegian terrorist network. It's the country that is spending as much as all other countries of the world combined on its so-called defense that is creating enemies for itself around the world. Our top officials in the U.S. military and the so-called intelligence agencies and former government officials from every branch routinely admit that it's counterproductive. Stanley McChrystal admits you create 10 enemies for every one you kill. I think that's a low number, but it's widely acknowledged that it's counterproductive. We have U.S. troops in 175 countries, and they are creating hatred and hostility and antagonizing the world. Well, if you stopped doing that, you wouldn't be creating that animosity and that hatred. There was a survey done a month ago of 65 nations asking people in this nation and in 64 other nations, what nation is the greatest threat to peace on earth? Who do you think won? You are absolutely right. Who do you think won in the U.S.? Now I stumped you. Who did United Statesians say?
When was that done?
It was published about a month ago. I'm not sure when it was conducted, but
Iran.
Now, you were at the last event, so you know. Yes, Iran, of course. 30 years of bombarding us with the idea that Iran is a threat to the United States and building nuclear weapons. Iran has never had a nuclear weapons program, has no intention to have a nuclear weapons program, spends less than 1% on its military of what the United States spend, as is the case with most countries, has not attacked or threatened to attack another nation in centuries. That's not something we can say. This is what propaganda is capable of. But the rest of the world has actually come to understand that the United States is a threat to peace on earth, that the United States sells weapons to other countries far and away exceeding what anybody else does. Dictatorships and democracies and every other kind of government, they're buying U.S. weapons. They're being given U.S. weapons. They're fighting wars with U.S. weapons against other nations with U.S. weapons. So when you support the military industries and your neighbors who need a job in the weapons industries, it's not all good xenophobic patriotism. It's weapons that are going a lot of places. And it's not increasing security or safety or protection of people in the world. The wars are not needed for defense. There is not another Adolf Hitler coming. We've been falsely identifying everybody from Noriega to Hussein to Assad as the new Adolf Hitler for 3/4 of a century. There is not a new one coming. These guys are not it, and there's not about to be another one. And if another nation, outrageous as it sounds, if another nation were to invade or attack the United States, there are more effective tools to be used than war to counter. We have 100 years of well-documented success of other tools being more effective. The United States could be supporting the rule of law. We could have a United Nations that was of nations, not of 5 nations. We could have an International Criminal Court of Africa that was beyond Africa, that was for the world. We could have people nonviolently resist an occupation, people from the occupying nation refuse to take part. Human shields come from other nations. Sanctions and prosecutions of war makers, not of peoples. There are far and away superior tools just in effectiveness and long-lasting success, not just in morality, to war. And yet, if it's too much for people to grasp that, if people think we must have military defense, you can cut 90% of U.S. military spending and keep every scrap of it that's in any way defensive. The rest of it is offensive. The ships that are made in a harbor near here have no defensive purpose. putting aircraft carriers in other people's waters and drones in other people's skies and troops in other people's nations and weapons in outer space has nothing to do with defense. If you wanted to have a Coast Guard and a National Guard and anti-aircraft missiles, you could have those, and that would be a huge step in the right direction if that's all we had. The rest of it is not defensive. We've just renamed the Department of War the Department of Defense, which was done the same year that a book called 1984 was written. It's something that we have to get beyond, the idea that war makes us safe because it endangers us. And people will pay any amount of money for something that makes them safe. But this isn't it. The idea that war is beneficial. The majority of Americans believe that Iraqis benefited from the war that destroyed Iraq. A strong plurality believe that Iraqis are grateful. A majority of Iraqis believe they are even worse off after that war than they were before. So this is the level of willful misunderstanding, misinformation, disinformation, and arrogance to tell people who believe they're worse off that they're really better off. They just don't know it. And we, from afar, from above the bombs, know better. This is an incredible level of arrogance. The distinction that's generally made by good liberal professors is between war and genocide. And we need war to deal with genocide. But in these wars, well over 90%, possibly 99% of the deaths are on one side. Americans believe that at least half the deaths in the war on Iraq from 2003 to 2011 were Americans. And they should. If they read U.S. newspapers, every single death is an American. At least 95% Iraqi. And at least 80% civilian by anybody's definition. I have a problem with every definition of civilian versus militant. But by everybody's definition, it's mostly civilians of every age and background, grandparents down to infants, and it's mostly on one side. And so the distinction between a war and a genocide is a very subtle one. And when you look at the way that militarism and wars contribute to the generation of genocides, you come to stop making this biased Western distinction between our good wars and other people's bad genocides and civil wars. And it's largely a question of information, not ideology. We need better facts, and people are unwilling to accept and to hear facts that are disconcerting. So it's not just a question of providing information and we're done. We have to provide it 8 times. But that means that we can move people's opinion, and people's opinions are being moved. But then, of course, there's the idea that, well, war benefits us in the aggressor nation, whether we really like it or not. It's good for our economy, which is false. Even tax cuts for working people produces more jobs than military spending, much less spending on infrastructure, education, so forth. But the idea that we get to exploit the rest of the world because of war, that the reason 5% of humanity gets a third of the resources is because we have the threat of war hanging over everybody's head, I mean, that would be reprehensible if it were true. It's not a legitimate justification for anything, but it isn't true. That lifestyle, that level of consumption and destruction of the atmosphere and the land and the oceans is going to kill us if war doesn't. We have to change that way of living anyway. And we can have as enjoyable a lifestyle with less consumption, less destruction, and to the extent that we want to buy things from other people, we have more than enough money with which to do it without bombing them. It costs more to bomb a country than to buy its resources. So it's not a sensible idea that anybody's benefiting from war. I'll go through this quickly, but these are arguments in support of doing away with the whole institution of war. The first is that war is not a moral enterprise, and this becomes clear if you understand these wars as one-sided slaughters of, for the most part, completely innocent people. It's not something that our friends and neighbors support. It's something that they don't want to be aware of. War endangers us, doesn't make us safer. It also risks destroying us entirely through nuclear and other weapons that are proliferating and that we risk seeing destroy us accidentally or intentionally as long as they are around. We often try to decide if we're going to be an anti-war activist or an environmental activist or an anti-plutocracy activist or what are we going to be for education? What's going to be our niche? We have to be the Occupy movement expanded. We have to bring them all together, and they all overlap and interlock. And even though the big environmental organizations won't take on war, won't take on military spending, can only be brought in unique little cases to take on a particularly destructive base construction or something of the sort, war is the biggest destroyer of the environment we have. You know, the wars are not just fought for fossil fuels. Don't just teach everybody that fossil fuels are cool and macho and the sun and wind are for wimps. But war is using the fossil fuels in an incredible extent. The majority of petroleum consumption during the peak of the war on Iraq was in Iraq, globally. The U.S. military would rank around 32, 33 in the list of nations if it were a nation in terms of petroleum consumption. The obsession with the Middle East started with the British wanting to fuel their ships, their naval ships. Not the wars weren't for the oil for something else. The wars were for the oil for wars. And so we have to break away from this incredibly destructive force. And that means slowly getting the local and the state and the national and international environmental organizations willing to take on one of the biggest enemies of the environment that we have, which thus far they have been very reluctant to do. Same goes for civil liberties organizations, which do incredible work on torture and assassination and detention, all of which abuses escalate in direct proportion to military spending. And they won't touch it. And Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch produce wonderful reports on drone killing, but they won't accept that it's all wrong. So they want to distinguish between good drone killing and bad drone killing, and distinguish based on the president's opinions, which he won't show them, and therefore they can't decide. Well, that's not how laws are supposed to work. And we have laws on the books, nationally and internationally, from the Fifth Amendment to the UN Charter, which our human rights groups refuse to recognize, to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I'll be speaking about, to the opinions of the courts in Pakistan and the nations where the missiles are hitting, that say it's not legal to kill people. Doesn't matter what secret memo the president might have or not have. A policy is not a law. A law is something else. And so if we're not going to take on the disease, if we're just going to keep going after the symptoms, we're going to have an uphill battle. We have to recognize that war produces atrocities, that war produces abuses, that no matter how many times you scream freedom during a war, you end up with fewer freedoms at the end of the war. And the secrecy that comes out of the idea that you have war enemies that must not know your government's secrets is used to justify your government in keeping secrets from the local population. So we aren't allowed to know what our government is doing because the government doesn't want Al-Qaeda to know what it's doing. Well, if you get out of this war mentality and you use other means of defending your country that actually defend it and defend it from real threats, like the climate crisis, rather than manufactured threats, like the Iranian nuclear weapons program that does not exist, then you get rid of the primary justification for the secrecy and for the spying and for all of these abuses that were scandalous when Bush was president and are now policies. And because they're policies, we sort of skip over the question of whether they're legal. So there is much to be done in the area of civil liberties that would benefit from getting rid of war. War does not make us richer. It impoverishes us. It drains our economy. It increases inequality. It funnels money to the top of the economic ladder, and it cannot be continued like this for economic reasons alone. The commission to convert from weapons industries to peaceful industries that Connecticut has just established should be established in Maine and every other state and advanced. This is for purely economic reasons, which is why they've got the manufacturers and the unions and the peace groups and the environmental groups on board with that program in Connecticut. $1 trillion a year from the United States, plus $1 trillion a year from the rest of the world put together. $1.5 trillion from the United States and its NATO allies, across various departments, not just the Department of so-called Defense. This is what's wasted every year on militarism. This is what could advance green energy or any other useful enterprise beyond the wildest dreams of its advocates. We could take $40, $50 billion a year and end starvation, hunger, and unclean water everywhere on Earth. We could have in this country the biggest tax cuts for working people ever dreamed of, the biggest investment in education and infrastructure and green energy ever imagined, and give it to the rest of the world too. We could be building schools and hospitals everywhere and be the most beloved people on Earth for a fraction of what it's costing us to be the most hated and feared people on Earth. So there is a need to move the money. We have this endless debate in this country, no cuts, more spending, more spending. You hear that from one side, and cut spending, reduce government. You hear that from the other side. Nobody talks about the fact that half of what the government spends its money on, and I don't mean just wars, but more than half, you count the fossil fuels and the highways and all of the profiteering, is evil things. Move the money. Spend the money differently. It's not just more or less. And it's very hard to squeeze that debate into our communication system. So we have to advance other means of doing away with war, of handling crises, of avoiding creating crises, of dealing with conflicts when they inevitably arise. And this means advancing nonviolent tools and the rule of law and replacing or reforming the UN and the ICC. We have to build a widespread international coalition, not just against a particular war, but against the institution. And we have to take on racism and nationalism, and we have to disarm, and we have to work on education and communications and get rid of secret agencies as well as military agencies. There's a long list of approaches and tools and resources on the World Beyond War website. And I encourage you to go there and to use the resources and to spread it around. So I think I'm done using this tool, and whoever made it work, I'll leave it on this list. I'm very, very grateful. It worked. This is the first time I've ever used technology and had it work. So one of the ways that we can build a different understanding of war and work towards its abolition rather than its reform and its civilization is to go back before World War II, when it was absolutely acceptable and normal and patriotic and non-treasonous to oppose war in the United States, which hasn't really been the case since World War II, which has never really ended. And if you go back, this is what I wrote about in When the World Outlawed War. If you go back to the 1920s, some of our great-grandparents were working to eliminate war, and they had a vision of a world without war, and they very intentionally wanted to eliminate all war. Not unjust wars, not bad wars, not Republican wars, not the evil wars, but all war as an institution. They were looking at slavery, they were looking at blood feuds, they were looking at dueling as a tool for settling disputes between individuals. They said, why can't if we can do away with dueling, why can't we do away with national dueling? And they didn't do away with aggressive dueling and keep defensive dueling around. Because if everybody's got the gun and the sword and they're ready for the duel, you've got dueling. So this is what we're going to do with war. We're going to get rid of it as an institution. And they knew that this was going to be the work of generations. They knew that there were several approaches needed, that they would have to disarm, at which they completely failed, that they would have to establish a world court and a world legal system, at which the United States failed after World War I. The U.S. Senate would not go along. They knew that it was going to be a process of steps. And the peace movement after World War I was incredibly in favor, worldwide and in the United States, of abolishing war. This was a peace movement with not just the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and other groups that are here in this part of Maine still, the groups that are going to turn 100 very soon, just like World War I is 100 this year. But the American Legion, the Parents Teachers Association, every religious group in the country, every mainstream organization, academic group, professor, banker. I mean, getting rid of war was understood in the 20s as the problem of the day to be solved. Annual contests with thousands and thousands of entries, how to do it. People like Andrew Carnegie setting up endowments for peace to do it. I love the instructions that Carnegie gave to the Endowment for Peace, which has now ignored them and is doing everything. But he said, eliminate war as the worst thing on earth, and then get the board together, hold a meeting, pick the second worst thing on earth, and start working on eliminating that. I mean, that's morality. That's ethics. That's what everybody should be doing, eliminating the worst thing on earth, and then the second worst thing. We don't do that anymore. Well, after World War I, after this greatest of all horrors up to that point, the people who fell for the propaganda about ending all war with the war wanted to follow through on it. And the people who never bought the sales pitch and went to prison resisting, they wanted to follow through on it too. Everybody did. And yet you had this divided peace movement. As we might think of libertarians and socialists. So you had the isolationists and you had the internationalists. And they couldn't come together. And they actually had meetings and negotiated and published formal settlements for how they would work together. And the primary way in which they figured out how to work together was on criminalizing war. They would ban war under law, and then they would work to make war unacceptable, to make it scandalous, to make it illicit, to make it something that society disapproved of. And then they would take these other steps of establishing international law and norms and arbitration settlements and disarming. Which again is where they fell down. But up until World War I, war was perfectly legal. Seizing of territory was legal. You could punish outrages. You could punish particular atrocities, but you couldn't punish the making of war. Nobody had done it. No, you couldn't do it. It wasn't on the books. War was like the weather. It came. And so the idea was to outlaw war. And so there was a movement called the outlawry movement. We were going to outlaw war. And they came up with a treaty. Some of them went and wrote a statement for the foreign minister of France, a peace advocate who had a Nobel Peace Prize in his pocket already. They'd publish this statement that you want an agreement with the United States to abolish war legally, ban it. And he did, and nothing happened. And so his buddy back over here in the Carnegie Endowment and at Columbia University wrote a response in the New York Times. This was the president of Columbia University. And said, why hasn't anything happened? Why isn't Congress moving on this amazing invitation? And they went back and forth with this sort of ventriloquist act until they got things going. And we had a Secretary of State named Frank Kellogg, short little one-eyed, drunk, hot-tempered, cursing Republican lawyer. He'd been president of the Bar Association. He'd been a trust buster. He was from St. Paul, Minnesota, where you ask anybody on Kellogg Boulevard in St. Paul, Minnesota, they'll say, well, it must be for the cereal. I think it's the cereal that it's named for, even though that's from Michigan. Frank Kellogg was Secretary of State, hated peace activists, had nothing to do with peace, cursed peace activists as he cursed everyone in his drunken rages. But in a period of less than a year, incredible public pressure. All of the women's groups that had sold out on World War I, got the right to vote, now said we are going to get rid of war and we're going to use our right to vote. All of these institutions from across the political spectrum that had united around this thing just flooded Washington with meetings and publicity and petitions and lobbying. And Frank Kellogg started telling his wife, maybe I could get the Nobel Peace Prize. That'd be pretty cool. And he did. And he got the Nobel Peace Prize. And the peace movement pushed him and Briand, the foreign minister of France, and many other nations. It got dozens of nations together in a room in Paris, France, on August 27th, 1928, in a moment that's depicted in a song from 1950 called "Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream I Ever Dreamed Before. I dreamed the world had all agreed." Those men in that room, this is not a fantasy from 1950. This is the top news story in every news outlet in the year 1928. They banned war. They abolished war legally, made it a crime. And territories stopped being seized. Territories were returned. Wars were prevented. Wars were halted. The world understood that there was a problem with war now. And when World War II came, because of the support for the Nazis and the fascists and the armaments and the ongoing failure to understand and the need for defensive wars and the profiteering, World War II came. At the end, a guy named Franklin Roosevelt pulled out this piece of paper called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the Peace Pact, the Pact of Paris, and said, let's prosecute the losers for the crime of making war. And if we could do that, then we can prosecute them for every little thing they did, because it was all part of a grand crime. And so it was one-sided, but it was a prosecution. And from that day to this, the big wealthy nations of the world haven't gone to war again with each other. They've just waged endless war on the poor nations of the world. But the story goes, in the thinking of international lawyers, Kellogg-Briand Pact didn't work because World War II happened. Well, I mean, if you banned drunk driving and then the first guy drove drunk and you said, well, that didn't work, tear up that law instead of prosecuting him. You know, imagine if you prosecuted the first drunk driver and nobody drove drunk again. You know, and there are other reasons that there hasn't been a World War III, the presence of nuclear weapons among them. But the Kellogg-Briand Pact, you know, you don't throw out treaties because you think they haven't worked yet anyway. I mean, this is bad lawyerism. But this is a treaty that's on the books with 85 nations party to it that bans all war. And when they want to legalize torture or corporate campaign bribery or wars, they pull out, you know, vetoes of the War Powers Act that Richard Nixon wrote, even though it got overridden, marginalia in federal court proceedings, you know, all kinds of crap that's not law. We want full employment, peace, you know, things that we care about. They're law. They're on the books. We just don't pick up those pieces of paper and wave them around. So when 33 nations a couple weeks ago in Latin America signed an agreement that they wanted a zone of peace in Central and South America and a complete ban on war and the threat of war, directed perhaps at a certain neighbor of theirs, you know, that was the kind of step that ought to be taken. We can also pull out existing laws and hold them up. And that's much easier. But both of these steps need to be pursued. And I wrote about the movement that produced that particular treaty, not so much because we should hold up the treaty and try to get compliance with it, although that's part of it, but because of the understanding of people in that movement and their willingness to think long-term and their willingness to think outside of the norm and their ability, which was aided by the structure of society in that day, to challenge the very institution of war. And I would like to hope that we can get back to that. And one way that we can is by taking initiatives like WorldBeyondWar.org and going to the Rotary Club and saying, did you know that you've been on record for 85 years for the complete abolition of war? Would you like to restate that commitment? Because anybody who was around back then was on board and can be brought back to that position. So it's intended as a piece of encouragement. So to brag about my book, a guy I like named Ralph Nader put this on a list of the 10 books that every American should read. Maybe I should have mentioned that at the last stop where I sold out of my other book. So I do have that book, When the World Outlawed War, and I'd be glad to talk to you about anything that's on your minds. And thank you for coming out in a blizzard.